Today we'll be having a look at strings in Mips, but before we do that let's have a look at strings in a higher level language like C. We'll be using C because C uses pointers much like Mips. Most of the code we use in C will be extremely similar to the Java code. I'll point out where it's not, so don't worry about looking at C. So in C, strings are a sequence of bytes terminated by a null value of 00, 0. C doesn't specify an encoding or what the byte means, but we sometimes will use things like Ascii to represent the string in byte form. Now, if you'll probably have heard me mention briefly before, but we have Ascii and Ascii Z in Mips. Ascii Z is the one which terminates with a null value, 00, 0, so that's the one I would probably recommend you use, unless otherwise specified. So let's have a look at this table here. So at the address 100fab5, we have the single character exclamation mark or a single character string, and we have its Ascii representation, which is the value 21. So now Ascii takes a byte and translates the value to its corresponding character. So we have a value for each character in a string. Now this is terminated by the value 00, which corresponds to null as an empty string. So when we get to the end and we find that there's a null value at the string, that's where it ends. And this means that you have to have n plus 1 bytes of memory to represent an n character string, because the final value will always be used to represent the 0 value or the null value. So we can store these strings much like we would anything else in Mips, like we just create it using the .asciiz instead of .word or .byte, and then we can load the address into memory. So just using a pointer there to represent the string. Now, one thing you probably haven't seen so much in Java, but you would be very familiar with if you did things like Haskell, which you will in second year, is that we kind of view strings in computer science as an array, where it's just a concatenated series of values. So my string, although it's an Ascii value, it's extremely similar to an array, and we can iterate through the values in a corresponding way. So let's have a look at some C code to represent counting a string's length. So the only difference between this syntax and Java is that *s value there that does not equal 0. And *s is the pointer in this case, so it would represent what we are getting from a value, so our brackets around a register to represent the address that value is storing. Here it's saying the value at the address given by *s if it's equal to 0. So what this array is, or this while statement is saying, we set the length to equal 0, and while the value stored at the address given by *s is not equal to 0, as in we haven't reached the null value yet, we increment the length and we increment s. So we go to the next area in memory to check there, but we also count the value that we've just encountered as long as it's not 0, and add it onto the total length. So let's see how we would do this in Mips. Well, we start off by loading our immediate value into v0, standard initialization of our values, so v0 is equal to 0, and then we start our loop. So we load the byte unsigned at, we assume that A0 is the address that we're storing this byte at, and we load the value from there into T0, so that's saying take the value from the address, load it into T0, and then we can say branch if it's equal to 0, because if it's equal to 0 we've reached the null termination at the end of our string, and so we want to jump past everything else. Otherwise, we add the values into v0, incrementing by 1, and we add into a0, incrementing the address by 1. Because they're bytes, we only need to increment by 1, rather than if they were words, we'd have to increment by 4, and then we jump back to the start. So that's everything I wanted to cover today. The main takeaway is that strings are extremely similar to arrays, and that we have a null value at the end when you use Ascii Z to represent the termination of the string. That's everything though. If you have any questions about anything I've covered today, please do let me know. Thanks.